scripture.
This is Esther, lesson 3, and we're looking at chapters 5 through 7. 5 through 7. We just want to go back. I want to go back and remind you of what happened in the previous chapters so that we stay in context with the whole story. So in chapter 1, we remember you had the king, the banquets, and the king was displaying all of his riches, letting everybody know everything that he had, what kind of a man he was. And at that banquet, the queen refused to come, and so she was deposed. This was in the third year of his reign. In chapter 2, Esther was made queen in her place. Remember that Esther was very highly thought of. She was beautiful in form and face, it said. And she was very highly thought of. She was made queen after the search throughout all of the provinces. This was in the 7th year, so this was 4 years after Queen Vashti was deposed. In chapter 3, you have Haman's plot to destroy the Jews. He has the king issue an edict that all of the Jews would be destroyed. Why was he having them all destroyed? What prompted that?
Mordecai not bowing down and honoring him.
Yeah, Mordecai, who is a Jew, would not bow down because he at this point is now second in command of the kingdom, and he has all authority and power, and he wants everybody to know that, and he asks everybody to bow to him, and Mordecai refuses to do it. And so he is furious with Mordecai. And so when he finds out that Mordecai's people are the Jews, then he is going to have them all killed, destroyed, and annihilated. Totally wiped out. That's in chapter 3. In chapter 4, Mordecai informs Esther of this plot and asks her to go to the king on behalf of her people. So chapter 4 ends with Esther saying she would do it. If I perish, I perish. And she calls for what?
Fasting.
A fast, while you are all shoving food in your mouth.
Yeah.
She calls for a fast, 3-day fast from all of the Jewish people to fast about this before she goes to the king, and she herself is fasting before she goes to the king. So that's where we pick it up in chapter 5, and it says, chapter 5 starts with, now it came about on the 3rd day. So on the 3rd day, meaning what? Third day of the fast. So this again is where, when you have a chapter division, you've got to go back and say, well, on the 3rd day, what's that all about? Well, it goes back to chapter 4, when she asked for a fast, and she said that she and her attendants would also be fasting for 3 days. So on the 3rd day, that fast. Now, she put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's rooms. And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. Now, what happens? What happens in this chapter? She approaches the king, and what do we know about this story here? What's taking place?
Well, this was a critical juncture right there, because if she would have come, she did come uninvited, and if he didn't acknowledge it and let that go, he could have had her killed.
Right. If you remember in chapter 4, she said, you cannot go before the king unless you're invited. And she had not been invited for how many days?
30.
30 days. So it's been 30 days since she's seen the king. And if you go uninvited, you run the risk of being put to death. So she approaches him, and is she invited to come in? Yes, he holds out his scepter, and she touches it. And what is the question he asks her?
What is trouble?
Yeah, what is troubling you? What do you want? Why have you come to see me? And he says what? He'll give her what? Even half the kingdom. Okay, so right here, what do you see about the relationship between Esther and the king? What's your take on where that stands?
She must have been very good in form and figure.
Okay, this is the 12th year. This has been now 5 years? 5 years since she's been queen.
Well, she's proven her loyalty.
So he is not upset at all with her approaching, and he's like, what's troubling you?
Yeah, he's
He
very,
sees that, and he's not oblivious to her
Okay.
countenance.
He's probably going to like her. He's like,
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
they have a relationship.
So, yeah, they have a relationship. So you can still see that in 5 years, they still have this relationship, even though she has not been to see him in 30 days.
She was,
But-
Critter was.
but-
Nancy out, there's nothing fixed.
He is still sensitive to her. What do you want? I will give you half the kingdom. Okay, half the kingdom is just an expression of whatever it is you ask, basically, I'll give that to you. Okay, so he asked, now how does she respond to this?
She invites him to dinner.
She invites him to a banquet. Banquets are throughout this whole book. So she invites him to a banquet
With him.
with Haman, okay, with Haman. And so the banquet, it takes place, she says it's ready, would you come to the banquet? So he agrees. They send for Haman, and Haman comes to the banquet. He says, do it quickly so that we can do as Esther desires. As they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther, what is your petition? So he's asking her a second time. What is your petition? What is it that you want? I'll give you up to half the kingdom. Does she tell him? No. So why? What does she say?
Come back tomorrow.
Come back tomorrow. Okay, come back tomorrow. Come back tomorrow. What do you think about that? If you had an audience with the king and he asked you, what did you want? And he's already agreed to come to this banquet and asks again, and then you say, come back tomorrow, and tomorrow I will do what you ask. Tomorrow I will do what you ask.
maybe she was still a little uncertain about the whole thing.
Okay?
And just wanted to be cautious and, go in the extra measure, and it's hard to say.
But in those years, she learned how to work him too. She was kind of maybe sitting Haman.
She was Haman up.
She was setting Haman up. She was maybe still cautious. It doesn't say, right? It doesn't say. So what we have to look at is all the circumstances that happened because of this. Risky on her part? Is it risky on her part? Yeah.
I'd Vashti deposed.
Yes. Right. So it's risky because it's a risk for her to go to the king in the first place. Now he's had the banquet and says, what do you want? And she says, would you come to another banquet tomorrow? And I'll tell you. That's risky, okay? We don't know what was going through her mind. We don't know, like Dave said, was she still cautious about it? Did she not sense that the king was in the right spirit? Was she trying to bait, and set Haman up? All of those things possible. We don't know. But what do we know for the end of chapter 4? When did this take place? Chapter 5 starts out on what day?
After the fast.
The third day of her
Day
3-day
33.
fast. So she has prepared her heart. She is listening. So who knows what in that fast she's been directed to do. So you have to put that in the picture too. She's been fasting for direction. So she has boldly said, please come to another banquet tomorrow. What happens? Tell me what happens.
I wonder what she.
Let's talk about Haman. Okay, so Haman comes to the banquet, the first banquet, and he's pretty arrogant,
Yeah,
but
this feeds his ego all the more.
yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just going to be him and the king.
Yeah, yeah. Now, and we know from the previous weeks what kind of character Haman is, right?
Mhm.
Very arrogant, very powerful, very proud. But now he's just excited because it's all about him. He's been in a private audience with the king and the queen. So what does he do when he leaves the banquet?
He sees Mordecai, but of course Mordecai doesn't stand up, and so Haman gets angry.
So he goes from this high to a low because he's so excited about this audience with the king and at the private banquet, and he sees Mordecai and just boom, all that anger comes back. How does he handle that anger?
Well, he is able to control it, but then he's got some bad friends and wife.
Okay, so he's able to control it at the moment. Then he goes home, and what happens?
They get him all worked up about it.
Okay. So he goes home, and he says he gets his friends and his wife. He gathers them all around him, and what does he say? What does it talk about? What he says to them?
He goes through this whole litany of how great he is. His riches, his sons, every instance the king has magnified him, how he's been promoted, and even Esther the queen
Yeah,
had me come along.
right. Yeah, he just lays out. This is how powerful I am. This is what I have. Think about chapter 1. Who did that in chapter 1? Who was? Remember chapter 1? What happened? Why was the first banquet? The king called everybody in, and what did he do?
Well, display his glory.
Display all my glory. Okay. And now here is Haman doing the same thing to his friends and his wife. Look at how great I am. And even Esther the queen, has invited me to this banquet. And she's invited me again tomorrow. I mean, how's Haman feeling? You know, except for one thing. What is it that is just driving him crazy?
Mordecai the Jew.
Mordecai the Jew. He says, here's an important thing. He says, he gives all this list of what he has and how important he is. And then in verse 13, what does it say?
Doesn't satisfy him. Every time he sees Mordecai sitting it just grates on him.
And yet, all of this does not satisfy me because of Mordecai.
Mordecai is reigning on his parade.
Yes, Mordecai was reigning on his parade.
We didn't like that.
Yeah. What can we learn from this about life itself? About what happens to us? What would be our life lesson from what we just see in what Haman is doing here?
Be grateful for what you have, not
Yeah.
coveting what you don't have.
Right.
And also, I think we have to be careful that we don't let one little tiny thing, and basically an insignificant thing it should be in this man's life, steal our joy.
Right.
One little tiny thing.
Right. One thing, you can have so much joy, and then one thing that just nags at you steals all that joy. It made me think about Hebrews where it says, don't let a root of bitterness grow up. Because what happens when that bitterness just kind of festers inside? It's going to destroy you. It's going to destroy you. So this one thing, he has everything, and this one thing, just he can't deal with it. It just makes him unhappy. Yeah, I think that's so easy. I mean, it's just so easy for us to focus on the one thing in our life that bothers us, the one thing that makes us sad, the one thing that we don't have. So and yet all of this does not satisfy me every time I look at him. It's a huge, I put it next to, in my Bible, LFL, I always write that lesson for life. So in my margin, I write those down. So it's like, this is what I need to learn from this. Don't let one thing steal your joy. And you have
And so many times those are the things you cannot change. You
Yeah.
cannot change them.
Yeah. So many times those are the things you can't change. Does Haman think he can change it?
He's thinking.
He's thinking he can. Okay. What's the other part of this? he's got all his friends and his wife, and he tells them this, and what's the solution they all come up with?
Murder.
Murder.
Yeah. Just wipe out that one thing, and you'll be happy. Wipe out that one thing. Just totally destroy it, and you'll be happy. Again, taking it to our own lives. I mean, is that the way we approach an issue in our life that is stealing our joy? Are we going to wipe out that person or that thing? What is it? How should we handle that kind of thing? Biblically, what should we do when things are not going well in a certain area? We attack that person, we attack that problem with anger.
Should give it to God.
Yeah.
We go to Hasi to join in with us. Like he went and he talked to his people and come and be on Team Mordecai. And let's go after it, and we take our issue, and I am so guilty of that. And talking
Yeah,
about
I'm
it.
not asking for confessions, but
But it's the
But-
truth.
it is true. What did he do? He gathered around him people who were sympathetic to his cause, you know, and divided. And we see this all the time, don't we? Something happens like in a corps, and people take sides. The person who's been offended gathers people around them to take sides. And sometimes it causes church splits. It causes family divisions. Because instead of dealing with it spiritually, people deal with it from this human perspective and their own hurt and their own anguish, and then they gather people around them who will support them and say, yeah, kill him.
Well, did he have to go, did Haman have to go by the king's gate every time? Or was he just doing that? I mean, I would like go a different way so I
Take a
wouldn't
back
torture
door
myself.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's like, just stay away from the whole situation. It won't
Yeah.
bug me then. But-
Because we know, where was Mordecai by this time? Where was he every day? At the gate.
We know he's
At the gate, okay, at the gate. So he would be seen among the leaders. Yeah, so every time he walked out, he could see him, and Mordecai wouldn't bow. But he had already had a plan in place to deal with that in chapter 4, right, with the edict. So he's just waiting for that 13th day of the 12th month for this to take place. But it's just bugging him every single day. Every single day. Yeah, this is such a picture of what we do. You know, what we tend to do, humanly speaking, is just gather people around us who, you know, will sit and say, oh, you poor thing. Oh, you poor thing. You could be happy if you just get rid of Mordecai. So he agrees. Good idea. Good idea, he says. And so what does he do?
So he had the gallows made.
He has a gallows made. They suggested just build a gallows and hang him. Ask the king to have him hung. Okay. Now, the next day he's going to have him hung, and the next day he's going to this banquet that Esther is providing again, that he's so excited about going to. But once Mordecai's out of the way, then I can really be happy going to the banquet. So a big lesson here for us, you know, in how he's handling this situation. But the next day, so this is where it gets good too. It's like the next day, it says during the night, chapter 6, during the night, that very night, so Haman has come up with a plan. He's busy building the gallows, and during that night, what happens with the king?
He couldn't sleep. Yeah, couldn't sleep.
He couldn't sleep. He could not sleep, and so what does he ask for?
Book of records.
The book of records. And when he's read the book of records, what does he?
Well, that'll help you.
Light reading.
Yes.
This will put you to sleep.
Maybe why he asked for that book
Yeah.
of records is like, well, that'll put me to sleep, yes. But in it, what does he discover?
The account of Mordecai.
Okay, the account of Mordecai. Remember when it said in chapter 2, remember when Mordecai in chapter 2 foiled the plot to kill the king? And it was written in the book of records. That's what the Book of Chronicles is, basically. It's a historical book of records of things that happened. You'll find Chronicles documents what happened in Kings. So most of those things will just kind of dovetail together, but it's a book of records. And he found in there that Mordecai, in fact, had been the one who saved his life. Saved his life. And what does he realize?
He hadn't been rewarded.
He has not been rewarded. So here we have at the end of chapter 2, Mordecai saving his life. And then he's not been rewarded. Then Haman is promoted to second in charge. And now 5 years later, 5 years later, the king can't sleep. And he reads about this and he's like, well, what have we done? We have not rewarded this man for saving my life. So tell me what happens next. This is so good. So good. Yeah, it's so funny.
Well, like he's done in other times, he seeks counsel. He doesn't just come up with what to do on his own. He says, well, let's
Yeah,
find
the king seeks counsel.
who's here that I can talk to about this. And of course, it's only Haman who's there.
Yeah, the king says, who's here that I can talk to about this? We have to reward Mordecai, so who's here? And of course, there's Haman there. Why is Haman there?
Because he's trying to get Mordecai.
He's trying to get Mordecai hung. So he's there because he's going to ask the king to hang him. Gallows have been built during the night. And in the meantime, the king is like, we've got to reward Mordecai. Yeah. So what happens?
Well, but first he kind of like he asks the question, so Haman doesn't know who he's talking about.
Right.
So Haman will like say how somebody like that should be honored. So he's like shooting himself in the foot because then he has to execute that.
Yeah. Yeah, because, well, see, who does Haman think he's talking about?
Yeah.
Of
Who
course
would
he's
the
talking.
king desire to honor more than me?
Right.
More than me.
Of course it's
After
me.
all.
Who else could there be?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that speaks to his character, his pride, and all of that. So of course he's going to say, well, here's what I want. When I'm honored, here's what I want.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was very elaborate. You know, take a robe that the king has worn and put it on him. Put him on one of the king's horses. Yeah, take him through the town. See, this is what the king does for someone that he's honoring. Okay, and the king's like, great idea. Great idea. Haman, you go do that for Mordecai, the Jew. Yeah.
We were just saying, we can see Haman like, I can't believe I'm doing this. This is so stupid.
Whose idea was it? Oh, it was my idea.
Yeah. I mean, you got to imagine Haman's. I mean, he cannot be disobedient to the king. We know what happens when you're disobedient to the king. But yeah, he had to go do it. And it said, do it quickly. So here's Haman. He comes in to ask permission of the king to hang Mordecai, and instead the king says, "Go get my robe and put it on him, lead him around the city on a horse, you know, and honor him." Yeah, yeah.
And
that poetic justice, absolutely. So everything, the tables are just being turned on him.
And he goes home crying.
Okay, and he goes home. He goes home crying. So the night before he went home after the banquet, honored, happy, and he gets his friends and his wife and he tells them all of these wonderful things. And then, but he's just upset with Mordecai. They come up with this plan to kill Mordecai. So he's happy again. Then he has to do this, and now he goes home mourning. I'm trying to find what verse that is. It's 6. 12, thank you. So Mordecai, what does Mordecai do after this great honor?
Return to the gate.
He just returns to the gate. Right? So what do you see in Mordecai's personality here?
Humble.
Humility, yes. He just went right back to the thing that he was doing
Oh, that was
before.
interesting.
Yeah, that was a nice ride. Yes. So he just goes right back to what he was doing before. All of that honor didn't affect him. like Haman is just the opposite, right? So he goes home mourning. Now, what's the difference? We looked at mourning last week. What's the difference? Who was mourning last week in lesson 2?
The Jews were mourning, because their whole group of people are gonna get killed.
Right. So Mordecai was mourning, the Jews were mourning, they were all mourning because they were all going to be killed. Who's mourning now? And how is it different? Haman is mourning, and how is it different than when the Jews were mourning?
Because he's been humiliated, and his pride has been damaged.
His pride has been damaged. Right. Right, totally different situation. He's mourning because he's not getting what he wanted. And the interesting thing is, his wife and his friends, as he recounts to them what happened, what did they say?
You're hosed.
You're opposed. Do you want to elaborate on that at all?
Well, yeah, I guess it's in verse 13, it says, if Mordecai before whom you have, and this is before whom you have begun to, so they figured it out. You've begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, which they know he is. You will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. So I'm thinking they must have fairly good knowledge of the history going on before that with the Amalekites
So
too.
where was all this good advice the day before when they recognized
Yeah, that's
you?
interesting. That's
Well,
why
I knew
did,
you were the Jew that
Like,
day.
oh yeah, we should have told you you can't beat this guy.
Right, yeah,
I think they were telling him what he wanted to hear at the time, but now.
yeah. Well, and things seemed like, if you think about, the question is why was the advice the day before different? They knew he was a Jew the day before. But if you look at his position and everything that was happening, it seemed like he could overcome. The edict had been issued to kill them all. It seemed like he had the power to do it all. But now it's starting to crumble. And now they're thinking, oh, right. I think this history of the Jews is coming back into play. It's just interesting. They say if he's of Jewish origin, and you will not overcome it. You will not overcome it. This might be a good place to talk about God's hand in this a little bit. If you have your notes from last week in day 5, we looked up some scriptures about the deliverance of the Jews. In Genesis 12 and 13, what do we have in Genesis 12 and 13? It's on page 23.
Promise from God, I will bless you, I will give this land to you and your offspring forever.
Okay, so we're going back to this original covenant with Abraham. And he will bless Abraham, he will I will make your seed like the stars of the sky, the land will be yours forever. So that's the original covenant that he has made with the Jews. You were my people, and this will be forever. What about Jeremiah? Jeremiah 31.
I will plant the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. I will be their God. Only if heaven can be measured, which it can't, will Israel cease.
Okay,
Forever.
forever. Only if heaven can be measured, and it can't, will Israel cease. Will Israel cease. Ezekiel 37.
I will bring them back to their own land. I will make a covenant of peace with them forever.
Okay. Forever. They are God's people, and this covenant with Abraham is still intact. Is still intact. So here we are in the book of Esther, and Haman's wife says, if he's of Jewish origin, you won't win. You won't win. Because what was his plan? What was the edict?
Kill all the Jews.
To kill all of them. To kill them, to destroy them, to annihilate them. Okay, how does that fit with the verses that we just read?
Can't happen.
Yeah, it can't happen. God will not allow it to happen. So now we're seeing, where God is not mentioned in this book, right? But do we see him in this book?
Yeah.
Yeah, here's one of the things that we see. It's like he is still upholding that promise, that covenant that he has with Abraham. So this plot to annihilate the Jews cannot happen. God is going to intervene because we can't measure heaven. So he will intervene. So we begin to see that little picture of where God is playing in this story. So they say you won't win. They're getting smart now, you won't win. Then chapter 7. Well, at the end of chapter 6, this is 14. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. And it was tradition in those days that if you were invited to a banquet, you would be escorted. So that was not like the armed guard is coming. It's just the honored escort is bringing you to the banquet. Okay, it's time.
Kind of
So-
like the limo thing.
Yeah, with the limo, right, right. And you get in the limo and we drive you to the banquet. So at the banquet, this is now the second day of the banquet. And they're going to sit down and eat, and this is where it's all going to unravel. All going to unravel. So the king, now they're at the second day, they've had their wine at the banquet, and he asks again, what?
What is your petition?
What is your petition? For the third time he's asked her, the third time. And she says, and again, how does Esther approach this? How does she approach this?
She's so humble about it. It's not just like, all right, here's what I want. It's,
Yeah,
if I found favor in your sight, it just really, like, really not impressed with myself, like, just honest petition.
right,
It
right,
softens the request.
right. If I have found favor, she does not just blurt out.
Pleases you.
It's like, if I have found favor in your sight, okay, which she had up to this point, right? She's always approached him in humility and respect. If I found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me as my petition, and my people as my request. So here's my request. I want you to let me live and let my people live. What does she say? It says verse 4, because what?
She spells out what the plan was.
Okay, so she explains the plan to the king. Now, he signed the edict, right? So he knows of the plan, but he doesn't know
I
that
think
she...
he's in a place of authority where he can't read everything that's brought before him, so he probably signed this without even reading it at all. He trusted his advisors, so he just signed and kept on going.
Yeah, remember that when Haman brought it to the king, the king said, the money and the people are yours. You have authority. And he gave him his signet ring. So he had this authority. What did he not know at that time?
That Esther was a Jew.
Okay? And even, he didn't know Esther was a Jew. And even when Haman approached the king and said, there's this group of
I
people
know which group it was.
throughout your kingdom, he didn't say that we know of, he didn't say it's the Jews.
But somehow, by the time he gets to chapter 6, verse 10, then he says, and do so for Mordecai the Jew. So now he knows, but I've had a little question mark.
Yeah.
Well, when did he know?
Yeah, because he does know now that Mordecai is a Jew. And Mordecai, let's look back at chapter 2. Does it say anything about when he's foiled this plot? Let's see.
I thought he just read it in the Chronicles. that night before the maybe
So he doesn't know that like Esther goes with Mordecai?
Yeah.
He doesn't, he's
But he read that.
Yeah, apparently he doesn't have all these connections, but, and you're right, Carol, he could have read it, that could have been recorded in the Chronicles that he
Right.
read the night before. But
But even that, he
anyway,
still doesn't know about the connection between Mordecai and
yes,
Esther.
he does not know that the queen is Jewish, and
It says in 3:4,
He's fairly clueless.
King's servants read
All
the
is
king's
good.
case to Mordecai, why are you transgressing the king's command? Now it was when they had spoken daily to him and would not listen to him that they told him to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand, for he had told them he was a Jew.
yeah, he told Haman that he was a Jew. That's why he
I think
wasn't
he had
bowing.
told the,
Right. So yeah, he seems like he's at this level, and all that's happening under this level, he's not totally aware of everything. So he has delegated responsibility, which is what happens, in the government situation. People have delegated responsibility, but he wasn't aware at this level of everything. But it's all coming together now. So she says to him, we have been sold. We have been sold
He murdered.
to be murdered. And remember, what does Haman offer the king in order to sign the edict?
Lots of silver.
10,000 talents or something, remember? He says, I'll provide the money. I'll provide the money. We have been sold to be murdered. What happens?
And he was like, well, who did this?
Yeah,
Who would presume to do this?
who would presume to do this? And when Esther says a foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman. So she points the finger at Haman now and says, this is who it is. This is who it is. The king's response?
Anger.
Storms out.
He storms out. He's angry. He storms out, and while he's out, what happens? What does Haman realize?
He's eggs for his life.
Going down.
Yeah, it's like his wife said, you are doomed here, okay? So he realizes, when the king storms out in anger, he realizes that he doesn't have a chance unless he can beg the queen.
Because obviously she's got some influence here.
Yeah, obviously she has some influence, which he has seen in the last 2 days. So he throws himself at her mercy, only he gets too close to the couch that she's on. Remember that they would recline when they ate, and so she would be on a royal couch, and there was laws about how close you could approach the queen. So he has forgotten all that. And so when the king comes back in, he thinks what?
He's thrown himself on top.
Yeah,
you
that
almost
he's
feel sorry
assaulting.
for this guy, because he is just like, messing up all over the place.
He's messing up all over the place. So the king says he thinks he's assaulting the queen. Well, I mean, what did she just tell him? This guy wants to kill me and my people.
He's wicked and evil.
So he says, is he going to assault the queen in my own house? And so they take him away, and they hang him on the gallows that Mordecai was supposed to be hung on. Haman built for Mordecai's hang. So everything turned around. Everything turned around. Everything that Haman planned for Mordecai actually happened to him.
Do you think he was not very well liked by? I mean, I thought it was interesting that the eunuchs said, "Hey, he has this gallows right by his house. Let's take him over there."
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
they were.
Yeah.
They knew.
They knew what was going on.
Right. I think you're right. It's like not everybody would have liked him. He demanded respect. He demanded it. But the people in these places like the eunuchs, they would of course talk to each other. That's just be natural. I'm thinking of the book of Ruth where it said all the women talked about Ruth, they sit in the city and they talk about what's happening. So of course that's natural too. We all talk about things that are happening. We know what's going on. So yeah, he probably was not liked by everybody.
And she was probably respected by the eunuchs because they saw her on a daily basis in the house.
Wasn't it one of the eunuchs that favored her and gave
Yes.
her extra
Right, give
attention?
her extra names.
Right. I mean,
7 extra days.
Esther was highly respected from the very beginning when she was first brought in and they gave her special treatment.
And her
the eunuchs.
character had proven true.
Right, and all through it, she had proven her humility and respected people. So you're right, they probably didn't. And so they're like, oh, well, you know what? He has this gallows that's built, so
You missed the
put it to good use. Okay, let's just go back a little bit and talk about God in this book. How do we see God in this book of Esther, even though you don't see his name actually
Yeah, not
mentioned?
once.
What's that?
Not once, I don't think.
Not once. His name is not mentioned ever in this book. But how do we see him? Why is this book even in the Bible since his name is not in it?
Right. It shows, you kind of have to be careful how you look at it, because almost like, you could almost get into a whole predestination thing with it, like none of these people were in control. But he knew the decisions people were going to make, and he used those decisions to to accomplish his will, starting with Vashti refusing to come to his banquet. She had free will. She could have said yes or no. And I don't think God predestined her to say, no, I'm not coming, but he used that. And then and then the selection of the new queen, Esther from out of that. And then, and then it's like in anticipation of Haman coming on the scene and, and understanding knowing that the threat that he represents to the Jewish people. So you can kind of see his handiwork kind of used all those different events all the way through, and none of the players seemed. I'm looking at this. I think Shakespeare probably wishes he'd written the play on this.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It would be classic Shakespeare, yeah.
And even up to the point where the king can't sleep at night. Did he have a sleeping problem, or did something cause him not to be able to sleep that night? So he actually would read the Chronicles.
Yeah.
And it was all part of that whole plan, like Dave says. But
Yeah, there's other places in Scripture where people couldn't sleep, and then God spoke during that time.
And like all these pieces had to come together right at the time
Yeah.
that they did.
Yeah, the timing of everything, starting with the edict, when he cast lots for what would be the best day for this to happen. And it turned out to be 11 months later. Okay, so that allows time for all of these other events to take place, for God to have a plan to rescue the Jewish people. So starting with that even, because they say it's the
He had
God's.
a little bit of time, like after his family told him, you're in deep trouble
Yeah.
here. Well, now that but he couldn't even, there wasn't even a chance to escape, because right then they came for
Right.
him, so he had to go right then and there.
Right. While
There was
he
no
stuck.
alternative
Yeah.
for him. He was stuck.
Yeah. And let's go back and talk about in chapter 5 when Esther approaches the king for the first time. Why doesn't she tell him right then and there when he says, what's your request? So she approaches him. Why doesn't she tell him right then what her request is?
we don't know.
What's that?
We don't know.
Okay, we don't know, but
Maybe because the gallows weren't built yet, or
okay, yeah, the gallows weren't built yet. Things still had to happen in God's big picture, right, for this to play out. Now, number 1, if you look at verse 2 in chapter 5, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight. So her first request, she approaches him where? In the court. He's sitting on the throne. It's a public place. I mean, there are attendees in the room. So probably not the best place for her to,
Hey, your number one guy's a jerk, and
to say your number 1 guy is a traitor, okay? She hasn't seen the king for 30 days, okay? So
Right.
she could have been looked upon as a traitor herself, as treason. The king has no idea, okay, that his number one guy. So he's not ready to hear this yet. It could have been gossip, the women have been gossiping and they're saying that Haman, so the timing, the place was not right because it was the public court. The timing wasn't right for her to tell him that because he had no idea. And you're saying she's about to tell him that his right-hand man is evil and wicked and doesn't have his best interest. So the place and the timing would have not been right. So instead she asked him to a banquet, which is now off in a little private place with just Haman and the king. So again, she had the opportunity. Now it's private, but she didn't say. Then she says, let's have another banquet tomorrow. What happened in between the first banquet and the second banquet? The gallows were built because Haman's plan was, I'm going to kill Mordecai in the morning, and then I'll go to the banquet.
You also see Mordecai, or Haman, kind of lulled into this sense of safety and arrogance and pride that really kind of gets him into a place where he's shocked. I mean, there's no
Right.
chance to defend.
Right, his
It's just like,
defenses are
boom.
all down because he's been so built up. He just thinks I'm indestructible.
None of his allies were there with him at the bank. If he'd done that in the court, the king, he might have done like you. Well, what do you think we should do? And they're going to think, well, we got, we're allied. We got to be good to him. So, and they would have maybe intervened on his behalf. But having them by themselves, with just maybe some of the eunuchs around who were on her side, there was no one to give him advice to do
Right.
anything other.
Right, no one. And because he's going to plan to kill Mordecai, that's his plan. Then overnight the king can't sleep, reads about Mordecai. Here's another thing about God's timing. Okay, when did Mordecai save the king?
5 years ago.
5 years ago. And now he can't sleep, and now he's reading the story of it on the night that Haman is planning to kill Mordecai. And the king is like, oh, we need to honor him because he saved my life. So now when Mordecai approaches the king, oh king, if it pleases you, I'd like to hang Mordecai on the gallows. There's no way he's going to say yes now, right? Because he's just found out that he's the one who saved his life and he wasn't honored. So no, he's not going to say yes.
Mhm.
So the timing, Mordecai, here again is God's timing. 5 years ago, Mordecai did a great thing, but he was never recognized for it. Okay, but now, 5 years later, when he's honored for it, it saves his people. It saves his people. So God's plan, is so much bigger. God can see that 5-year period. God waits to have Mordecai honored until the time when it's going to benefit Esther and all the Jewish people.
Do you think that the suspense, I mean, here's a king that probably doesn't have much, how would you put it? I mean, he has everything he wants. So there probably aren't a lot of like interesting, challenging kind of things. But here comes Esther with this kind of almost provocative, well, let's do this again tomorrow.
Yeah.
And tomorrow.
I'll tell you.
Maybe that alone would have been enough to kind of get him like wondering and curious and just
Yeah.
kind of antsy and well, what is that? What's tomorrow? What's in tomorrow? What's going
Right.
to happen tomorrow?
Just a little mystique.
Yeah, just a little kind of, and for a king like that, it might have been interesting
Yeah.
to just kind of even wonder what was going on.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of things in there we don't know, just putting together pieces, but seeing God and seeing the timing of everything. And the king had to have time to see Haman, for who he was. If she had said in the very first request out in the courtyard in the palace, he would have been like, that's not true. Not true. But then he sees overnight and you put the Mordecai's honor in him, and then you see Haman come in and the eunuchs, like, oh, it's this gallows that he's built and everything, but the king needed time before he was told. So that delay tactic, was good. And again, she was fasting for 3 days for direction. So she's following direction about, what she's supposed to do, how she's supposed to do this. This is a very risky proposition.
And we would know for the Jew, the fasting wasn't just going without food. That would have been a time of petition, praying to
Right.
God. So that brings God into it. Even though
Right.
it's not stated, just the idea that she took that 3 days.
Yeah.
And even when Mordecai says to her, how do you know that you weren't put in this place just for this reason?
Right.
And that
Right.
references sovereignty
Right.
of the higher, even though he doesn't call it God, that you have been placed here for a purpose.
Because it's
Not
all
random.
about the Jewish people, and goes back to that covenant with Abraham.
And
So
it's
they,
not going to be broken.
they know this history of the Jewish people, so that all plays into this. And that's when he says, maybe you've been placed here for such a time as this. And remember that he said, even if you don't do it, and this is why we looked at those verses last week, if you don't do it, deliverance will come from somewhere else. That we know because of those verses we read. The Jews will never be annihilated.
I think that's why Abraham, when he took Isaac to the mountain, I never liked that story. It always bothered me until one time I was reading it that he knew there would be a ram provided because of the covenant that a great nation would come from his son. And that covenant was made, and he knew that he would never really have to sacrifice his son. But God took him to the test. And I think of Sarah, if she would not have jumped the gun and decided we have to throw our hands, it's about timing. And we wouldn't have the situations that the world has had. She decided to take, and that's what we do. We take it into our own hands, and we panic, and we pursue, and we storm ahead like a bull in a china shop when we need to be still and know that He is God, and He has covenant, and He's in control. And that's the hardest thing about being having personal choice.
Yeah, you just kind of summed it up pretty well. It's like, this was for them, they knew. They knew what God had promised to the Jewish nation. What do we know? What do we know?
And also Haman stood for what he believed.
Okay, Haman's, no,
Mordecai
stood for
Oh, Haman did too. He thought he was all that bag of
Yes,
chips.
Haman
That was
did.
wrong. But Mordecai did not be bent by the culture, by the rules of the day. He stood for truth, even though, like it says in Ezekiel 2, you have to say what's true. I'm a Jew, and this is what we don't do. We don't bow down to other people in a God form. So sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. So this all translates to us. If we know, what do we know about God? What do we know for certain about Him? And then how does that translate into the decisions we make in our lives? When you're in a very difficult situation, what can you know? He is in control. The timing may not be what we can see as rational. For Mordecai, 5 years earlier, he rescued the king. Then his recognition of that comes at a time when it will be good for his people. Mordecai didn't really care. He just went back to sitting at the front gate, right? But that honoring of him saved his people.
And 5 years before, he did what was the right thing.
Right.
He made the
He
right
just-
choice, and right
Right.
always
Right.
oversees
Right.
what's evil, and we don't see that today. And yet, I think that, we're worried about what's going on in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Yeah.
You know the end.
Right. Yeah. It's like that's the kind of thing we have to know. God is in control, no matter what it looks like.
Also, it shows when the king is surrounded by people that do not, or when Mordecai was surrounded by people who do not give right advice, I worry about our leadership,
Yeah.
and I pray for our leadership in our country, who they're surrounded by, maybe even more so than their position of leadership.
Right. And we should. I mean, God is in control. We need to pray for our leaders. We need to pray for wisdom. But God raises up leaders and He takes them down. And he is in control in the big picture. And we have to know that, just know that in our lives, that he is in control. And it will be played out the way he intends it to be played out for the good of everyone. So if I perish, I perish. That's what she said. And she went ahead with the plan, and God allowed enough time in between for everything to be put in place so that Haman could be exposed for who he was, and that the Jewish people could be saved. God is in control.